You see, everybody, literature, very important.
Very important.
Okay, but I thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you.
Best of luck, my dear. And
I'm here to help.
wonderful.
I'm here to help all the women. I'm in your corner, so please reach out. I'm here for you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
We are in Saratoga Springs celebrating the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, very close to where that movement all started.
My name's Elena. What's your name?
My name is Michaela.
Good.
Thank you, you too.
Women are coming together to really celebrate our empowerment, the right to vote, and map out a plan for the future.
This conference, more than any other conference I've been involved in, brings together an incredibly diverse group of people that are eager to talk to each other and eager to listen to each other.
Begins, and I was in the first graduating class.
All right.
Yeah.
So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Young women feel empowered today because if they look backwards, they'll find out that they're standing on the shoulders of the women's movement, and that men and women have worked very hard to create opportunities for them. For 6 years, we've been working on breaking the bronze ceiling over Central Park, and we're putting the first statue of real women in the park. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth.
That's wonderful.
They all fought for women's rights. Ceiling. And whether it's in your office space, whether it's in an inappropriate relationship there, whether you check and find out that you're being paid less for the same job, you either accept it or you do something about it to change it.
History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We're moving away from the great white men, great wars, great dates history. And that requires that we repopulate history with all of the voices. Then we begin to know what we're celebrating, what we're commemorating. It was not a perfect movement. These women pushed democracy forward, but they did it at the expense sometimes of African American and other women of color. They made the argument, give women the vote, because white, native-born women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. How many years have we not had the multiplicity of voices that it takes to make good decisions that are in the interest of everyone?
I love the dresses.
Isn't it amazing what they've done with the hair? In the 19th century, there was a burgeoning of all kinds of experimentation, esoteric religions, there was spiritualism, there was theosophy. This new religious voice opened the door for women's leadership in churches and other religious organizations that then gave them the tools so that they then could organize women for the vote. It was really about thinking about your own calling, your own conscience. Women's freedom of conscience was connected to women's liberty, and women's liberty was also connected to the anti-slavery movement.
In April of 1888, he was giving a speech in Washington, D.C. He was reflecting on his time in Seneca Falls in 1848. He said, "When I ran away from slavery, I did it for myself. When I fought for abolition, I did it for my people. But when I was at Seneca Falls and fought for women's rights, there was some nobility in that act." Frederick Douglass was definitely for universal suffrage, and so he understood the importance of the vote to elevate his people, but also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched. And when I think about what Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and what they were up against, imagine living at a time when your federal government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you. Your government is saying that. I think that many people would run away from that challenge, and thank goodness he and many others didn't, or we would be a very different country today.
Driving to the 19th Amendment. Use it. We will. For so long, we have just been consumers of technology and not the producers. We must insist that in every arena, in every boardroom where technology decisions are made, that women have voice. What would happen if all of these voices could come together to unify behind issues that are important to women and then work together in order to find solutions, either through our legislations or through our own sources of empowerment? These are the early suffragists striving for freedom. Sarah Breedlove, slave-born. Don't sit down and wait for opportunities to come. Get up and make them. Thank you, Sarah Breedlove, McWilliams Davis Walker.
As women, elevating our voices, what do you think would be our goal within the next, let's say, election cycle?
We talk a lot about gender parity, and I think that means all women have accurate representation in all legislative bodies. And so I'm completely behind the energy to get more Republican women in Congress, to get more unaffiliated and independent women and more women of color, because I think it's really only when people see themselves in government that the government really can thrive.
And we need to galvanize the inspiration of our young people, our girls, our young women, to be better, to have ambition, to demand more.
Starting this fall 2019, there will be 19.2 million college students in this country. Out of those, more than 11 million, a little more, 11.2, are women. If all these young ladies, these women, went out and voted, then we would see men and women in office who represent what matters to us as women. We're going to have our reproductive rights protected. We're going to have equal pay. We're going to have childcare.
Keep on representing, baby. We're going to ignite their minds.
Ignite their minds.
Their passion.
Their passions.
Let them feel it, understand it, explore it.
I would describe the character of the women in the suffrage movement as relentless and courageous. These women were not playing.
I had no idea that women had spent 2 weeks in prison because they were protesting, as is their right, in front of the White House. The women were tortured and chained. Why? When quitting would be so much easier, when everyone would fully understand if you just stopped and did the easy thing, which would be to walk away and not fight for your rights. And they didn't give up. They just didn't quit.
I'm inspired by all of them, but Inez Milholland died at age 30 on the public stage. She collapsed during a speech she was giving in Los Angeles. She accomplished so much, and she pushed the movement forward, and she was the icon of the movement. She was on the white horse, holding a flag that that said, "Forward to the light," and I think that she's just who you think of when you think about a suffragist.
If I could travel back in time and talk with any suffragist, I would pick Susan B. Anthony. She was certain that women would get their rights, but she was also very fearful that people, especially young women, would quickly forget what it took to get the right to vote.
She voted in the presidential election in the 1800s. She was arrested, and she insisted upon a trial because she wanted it to become part of the public record that she was being punished for exercising what had been a fundamental right. I think she was fined, but I do believe I read she never actually paid the fine.
I would love to tell her that after elections today, men and women make this sort of pilgrimage to her grave, and they put their "I voted" stickers on her headstone. And that she hasn't been forgotten, and the work and the
If I were talking to a suffragist and I were going back in time and, sitting down with a suffragist today, I would thank her for putting her life on the line to make sure that future generations had full citizenship rights. I would tell her that we are really trying to carry that torch, that we are not going to sit down, that we are going to take the spirit that they created for us and push it forward, and we are persisting.
CREWTV is a movement. We are civically re-engaged women, and this is the Seneca Falls Revisited virtual experience. It's CREW's Centennial celebration event commemorating 100 years of American women's right to vote. It takes place on July 23rd through the 25th of 2020. So go to crewwomen.tv to get your subscription today.
Do you know me? Well, American Express did not know me. Because when I was in the Congress of the United States and I applied for an American Express card, they said I couldn't get one unless my husband signed for it. So I called up Martin, my husband, and I said, what do you believe? You love me because American Express doesn't, and they want you to sign for my card. He said, I love you, Bella. I wouldn't trade you even for Joe Namath, but American Express is going to have to give you their own card, and I'm going to fight with you until we do. And so in the Congress of the United States, we passed a credit law in which we were able to get women to get their own credit. And so I didn't know whether I should really get an American Express card, but I decided I would so I could tell this story. So now I have an American Express card so I can tell the story that women fought for their own credit, so American Express had to give in. So carry an American Express card as a symbol of women's right to credit.
I'm Harold Holzer, and it's an honor for me to join in the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment by celebrating the 100th anniversary of someone who used to represent the 19th Congressional District in New York City. And if that's an awful lot of numbers to digest, they hopefully add up to one extraordinary woman who was born the year women got the vote, my friend and my boss, the late Bella Abzug. I'd be negligent if I didn't mention that this is another milestone in the life that we somehow were fated to share. It's the 150th anniversary of Hunter College, which is Bella's alma mater. She graduated in 1942. Hunter, I would say, changed her life, if for no other reason than it gave her exposure to lifelong pals like Min Kelber and Judy Lerner, who's still with us. Great teachers, great fellow students, activists all. And I know it meant a great deal to her. So I'm going to offer today a capsule race through, I guess, my life with Bella and Bella's life as I got to observe it and participate in it, with an eye on her role as an organizer. Her opponents often dismissed her as a rabble-rouser, but she was in fact a brilliant and effective coalition builder. As a lawyer, as a civil rights activist, organizing the first mothers against nuclear testing, and then ultimately formal organizations like Women's Strike for Peace and the National Women's Political Caucus. I met her, I will say, kind of as a prologue here in the middle of my talk, 51 years ago when I went to a place called the Pharmacy Center on West 69th Street in Manhattan with my wife-to-be. We were both reporters for a newspaper called the Manhattan Tribune, and we went to cover the first congressional debate for the 1970 race between Bella Abzug and Barry Farber, the radio host who died just a few days ago as I record. And we saw her for the first time, hat and all. And I should say, by way of explanation, that I intentionally put this hat in the background here in my den at home. And it is not a mere prop. It is Bella Abzug's hat, or one of them, which she was nice enough to give to me and sign inside the brim. So that is a Bella relic behind me. Anyway, that 1969 debate, framed at the dawn of the women's movement and the middle of the anti-Vietnam movement, was just revelatory. We both kind of just lost our hearts and our minds. Well, we didn't lose our minds, but we gave our commitment to Bella. Maybe we lost our minds. It was a good thing, though. And as we watched and reported and supported to the extent we could as journalists, as Bella built a candidacy against the anti-war movement and the women's movement, running against an entrenched pro-war congressman named Leonard Farbstein, who'd been there an awfully long time and had defeated opponents like future Congressman Ted Weiss. And to complete this concentric circle, the man who was our publisher at the time, William Haddad, who owned the Manhattan Tribune and who also, as I speak, just passed away about a few days ago. Now, Bella got the nomination that year, or at least the reform designation, to be in the primary by organizing. There was a reform caucus, a big convention, and when it began, one of the organizers said to Bella, well, you can't bring in these women's groups and have them act as delegates. And Bella's famous reply was, that's what you think. And guess what? All of the delegates who represented women's organizations were seated. Bella got the designation, and she became the reform designee to run for Congress. And it was a wild primary. And she had shopping bags that said, carry Bella to Congress, and a great slogan, this woman's place is in the House of Representatives. And celebrity supporters like Alan Alda and Jerry Stiller, who just passed away as I speak a few days ago as well, Alan Alda, all supporting her. And this woman's place was in the House. We covered that campaign. She won it doorstep to doorstep and defeated Leonard Farbstein, and then won a pretty tough race against Barry Farber. And again, had to organize like no other Democrat did in a largely Democratic district, once again, as showing her skill as everything possible that was negative was thrown at her by her foes. Her first few days on the House floor were pretty legendary. No, she did not tell the doorkeeper of the House. She demanded that, when he demanded that she remove it before going on the House floor, she never wore it on the House floor. I know that because I was with her more than once on the House floor. But yes, it's true, as my friend, the playwright Harvey Fierstein, just dramatized. She did tell the Democratic leadership that she loved to swim and she was going to use the House pool every morning at around 8 a.m. And she was told, well, that's not possible because the men use it from 8 to 9. You can use it after 9. And she said, well, I've got to go to work at 9. Why can't I use it while the men use it? And she said, and they told her, because the men swim naked. Bella said, well, just tell the boys I'm coming in. They never swam naked again, and Bella integrated the House pool. Now, for those of you listening who have watched the series on YouTube called Mrs. America, which is on one side the life of the political life of the anti-Bella, Phyllis Schlafly, but also the lives of Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Jill Ruckelshaus and Bella as they fought for passage of the ERA. Bella did not smoke, and she did not play the game as an entrenched, compromising Paul. Did she build coalitions? Yes, she built extraordinary coalitions. She was put on 2 committees where they thought she would fade away, Public Works and Government Operations. She did brilliantly at both, and she built consensus among members to get trade-in money for Westway to New York City mass transportation, to get funding for the money that New York City has always spent for UN protection during the General Assembly. She could not have done that if she did not know how to build coalitions. But she was also a dramatic, radical thinker. She got us the Freedom of Information Law, the Sunshine Law. She introduced the first gay rights bills, unsuccessful at first, but she kept fighting for them. And she won the respect of her speakers, Carl Albert and Tip O'Neill, but she not only dramatized the fight for the ERA and other issues, but she built consensus, which was her genius. She knew procedure and she knew the law. And anyone who underestimated her was bound to be quite surprised and astonished by what she could bring to any debate and any vote. Only 2 years later, she was redistricted. Shows you how important the census is. New York lost congressional seats, and her district was combined, of course, with that of a fellow progressive named William F. Ryan. And lots of people said, you should just give the seat to him. And she said, why? You know, not just because he's a man. It was her home district, Greenwich Village, the Lower West Side of the Rand, sweet taste of which was still in people's mouths for years and years to come. She lost the race, but Bill Ryan, who was sick through the entire campaign, died soon thereafter, and she was nominated by the party to run, and therefore remained in Congress without interruption in 1972 and was reelected without opposition in 74. In 1976, she had a big choice to make. Stay in the House and continue to accumulate power and influence, or run for the United States Senate against an accidental senator from Connecticut who happened to represent New York named James Buckley, who had won in a three-way race 6 years earlier and was perceived as very vulnerable. Bella decided being a woman senator was worth it. And let me remind the listeners that at this moment in time, there were no women in the United States Senate. And Bella thought that that was something that had to be addressed. In fact, her slogan, the House, but it was a reminder that that glass ceiling had yet to be cracked. I mean, it had been cracked a few times, but it needed a permanent shattering, and she was the person to do it. I was her press secretary for 2 years during that campaign. We visited 60 of New York State's 62 counties. She won support in every part of the state, but as history shows, in the end, she lost the race by less than 1% to Pat Moynihan, and he became the United States Senator. Bella did not rest on those laurels or on that, did not let herself get defeated or defeatist by that very agonizingly close loss. She immediately became head of the Women's Advisory Commission to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, in an effort to get ERA passed, ratified by the required 38 states. She campaigned tirelessly, and in 1977 chaired the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas. I was there again as her press secretary. First ladies were there, Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, Rosalind Carter, along with Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Billie Jean King, Coretta Scott King. It was an extraordinary event, never repeated again, really like the Seneca Falls conferences in its innovative organizing and its extraordinary array of diverse women, black and white, gay and straight, urban and rural, Native Americans and non-Native Americans, immigrants, an amazing consensus group of women representing themselves, their mothers, their daughters, their sisters, and even the reluctant women who did not understand or appreciate the struggle, trying to create a better world for women in the future. Later that year, Bella tried organizing one more political race. There would actually be two smaller races later. She lost a couple of comeback races for Congress, but she did run an exciting race for mayor of New York. One of the best remembered and most fractious and extraordinary races in the history of New York. She did not win that, but her loss was for the world in a way, because Bella, her fame and her celebrity undiminished, moved to an international phase and created the Defense Organization, a non-governmental organization in the UN, and worked in Africa, in Asia, globally, to invest in women, entrepreneurship, climate protection, really at the vanguard of issues that we now take for granted today, even though the fight continues. She went to Beijing for the Global Women's Conference. Hillary Clinton remembered her there well. In fact, I remember that when Bella died, Hillary, as First Lady, appeared at a Washington memorial for Bella wearing a hat, one of the great signs of respect that any political leader could communicate in that very difficult time. Bella also wrote an extraordinary book called Gender Gap, which reminded women of their power in deciding elections if they turned out, if they stayed true to the cause. Rather influential book in political science and women's studies, still taught today. And she raised that amazing voice, that clarion, that loud, brassy, but brilliant voice for as long as it held out. Always colorful, always topped off by that trademark hat, although Bella always said it's what's under the hat that counts. Inspiring a new generation. I worry, speaking of the new generation, that her legacy is a bit in jeopardy. She should not be forgotten. And it should be remembered she did it all. She fought against McCarthyism as a lawyer for people who faced the blacklist in the 50s. She fought for civil rights in the 50s and 60s, was the appeals lawyer in one of the most famous civil rights cases in history, the Willie McGee case, in which an African-American man accused of rape that he clearly did not commit was electrocuted after several appeals. She was a founder of the anti-nuclear testing movement, and of course will always hold a leading and secure place in the women's rights movement, not just leading women to organize, but working for equal pay and reproductive freedom and LGBT rights. As the leader of the so-called third wave of feminism, she made a lot of dreams of the founding mothers come true in the 70s and 80s. She took almost all of the incoming fire. There was something about Bella that got a lot of guys and conservatives angry. But in absorbing the flack, in enduring brutal, ugly criticism from time to time, let's never forget that she paved the way for future generations to have it a little smoother in their own activism. And remember again, she was born the year women got the vote, and she made her vote and her voice count beyond what anyone could have expected of a daughter of a Bronx, New York butcher. Maybe everyone but her mother and herself. Her mother gave her all the confidence that she needed to succeed, and she took advantage of every learning opportunity at Hunter, at Columbia Law, and turned her attention to public service almost immediately. It's also worth remembering that there were 11 women in the House of Representatives. Bella ran for Congress in 1970, 15 when she began serving a year later, and that was considered a wave. There were 101 women in the House in 2020, the Centennial year of suffrage. Still only 23%, but almost 8 times what Bella found when she in those years, in 70 and 72. We probably would not be even at a fourth today. When she ran for the Senate, no women in the Senate. Today, there are 26. Extraordinary. Still only a quarter, and Bella would probably say that's all, but it's an amazing change over the last 40 years. For me, she was a beacon of light and an inspiration. Not only what made New York great, outspoken, fearless, tough, also brilliant, impassioned, and ingenious. The kind of teacher that comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime, like a comet, really. And that's why I said in my eulogy of her more than 20 years ago that she was, for me, my graduate school, my teacher, in addition to my boss. So when you look at the YouTube special, Mrs. America, try to remember that it's not quite the original, that it's possible to be a coalition builder and an activist. All you have to do is look at the legacy of Bella and go beyond the caricature to the real person. She once said, women have been trained to speak softly and carry a lipstick. And Bella carried a lipstick, but she could outspeak any woman or any man, not just in volume, but in ideas and inspiration. So happy anniversary to the 19th Amendment. Happy centennial anniversary as well to Bella Abzug. She may not have been Mrs. America like or Miss America like Bess Meyerson, one of the figures of the 1970s that did not appreciate her greatness, frankly. But Bella was Ms. America. And for that, we're very, very eternally grateful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. In 2020, we are going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote in our country. And all of you who are following in the footsteps of the incredible New York suffragists who made this happen, with Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, who showed the nation that women and girls' voices truly matter. Please accept my best wishes for a wonderful event.
The 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, became enshrined in our Constitution. I, Mother, stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America.
The Equal Rights Amendment, when ratified, will help knock down those restrictions that have locked women in to the old stereotypes of behavior and opportunity. It will help open up more options for women.
What about the youth vote? We heard so much after Parkland and the March for Our Lives movement. They were really motivated. Are they really?
So there's two ways to look at that. The glass half full version says that yes, they are turning out in larger numbers than they have in previous elections. The glass half empty side, though, says that they're still underperforming. Let me give you an idea. 18 to 24-year-olds represent 8.9% of all registered voters, yet only 4.2% of them have voted so far. 18 to 34-year-olds represent about 26% of all registered voters, but only 12% have turned out.
A July analysis from the polling firm TargetSmart looked at the change in millennial voter registration before and after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. They found that since then, youth voter registration has increased nationwide by 2.1%.
We saw the response to the tragedy in Parkland was this sort of unprecedented surge in activism where you saw these Parkland students who really began the movement and brought in students from around the country where they had the March for Our Lives. And a lot of that movement was talking about turning that into political power.
Some of the biggest jumps in youth voter registration happened in key battleground states, like Pennsylvania with a 16-point increase, Virginia with a 10-point jump, and Florida with 8%.
a feeling of humility and a feeling of honor and a feeling of being blessed.
Are all emotions Michelle Joan Galvin feels when she thinks about her family's history. Jones Galvin is a fifth-generation descendant of Harriet Tubman, and along with her mother, they co-authored the book Beyond the Underground, which chronicles Tubman's life and her most precious beliefs.
Freedom for every single human being in this country and the world. She believed that no other person should own another person, and I think we can all agree to that, and that's what her work was all about.
Women are coming together to really celebrate our empowerment, the right to vote, and map out a plan for the future.
This conference, more than any other conference I've been involved in, brings together an incredibly diverse group of people that are eager to talk to each other and eager to listen to each other.
Begins, and I was in the first graduating class.
All right!
Yeah.
So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. This is Elizabeth. Young women feel empowered today because if they look backwards, they'll find out that they're standing on the shoulders of the women's movement and that men and women have worked very hard to create opportunities for them.
History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We're moving away from the great white men, great wars, great dates, history. And that requires that we repopulate history with all of the voices. Then we begin to know what we're celebrating, what we're commemorating.
It was really about thinking about your own calling, your own conscience. Women's freedom of conscience was connected to women's liberty, and women's liberty was also connected to the anti-slavery movement.
He said, when I ran away from slavery, I did it for myself. When I fought for abolition, I did it for my people. But when I was at Seneca Falls and fought for women's rights, there was some nobility in that act. Frederick Douglass was definitely for universal suffrage, stood the importance also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched.
Is this a good time for drinking? Like, is this a renaissance? Like, absolutely, it's a revolution is what it is. Everything's changed. So there's something that I'm just gonna call before the cocktail, BC, right? And really that's just thousands of years of human experience making mixed drinks, whether it's 6,000 years ago, rice distillate, hawthorn berries, all this junk thrown together, but it was a mixed drink, right? Greek drinks where they'd mix it with like feta cheese and wine, all the way to like punches and colonial drinks like syllabubs and rattle skulls and all these pretty awesome but weird drinks. Then the cocktail comes along. It's first defined in print in 1806, and it's like lightning. There's something about the cocktail that's so beautiful and simplistic. Its form is perfect, and it's sugar, water, bitters, and spirituous liquor of any kind. Before that, certainly some drinks like that, all the way to Prohibition. An entire country that can't agree on anything. An entire legislature that, just gets ground to a halt when they have to like figure out any little detail. All of a sudden, they agree, yeah, drinking's bad. It's like remarkable how this happened. And it really had to do with so many different things. Anti-immigration, women's suffrage, religious conflicts. Everything just fed into it. Coming out of Prohibition, home bartending became a little more important. My grandmother, her era, 1950s, and she said, well, when people would come over to parties, I would serve them a Manhattan or a gin martini. If they didn't like a gin martini, then they could have a Manhattan. If they didn't like a Manhattan, then they could have a gin martini. Tiki drinks became huge, and tiki was like a perfect foil for serious cocktails in a not so serious environment. Then the Mad Men era. We all like really admire that, even though it's probably like the most sexist, racist, like homophobic era of our time. Like, I mean, what awful political sentiments, but the drinking was cool and the style was cool. And then we get up to this, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, the 70s, disco. And what is cool at that point can't be your grandfather or your father's old fashioned, right? Like the Mad Men went from this real stylistic, cool era to like, those old guys? No, we're not drinking that. We are smoking pot, we are doing LSD. We're not concerned with alcohol. Then you get in the 80s and it's like really angular drinks that are like fluorescent colors, you know, blue, green. Oh, who cares what it tastes like? It's a blue martini, it's a green martini. But it just means that that was a time that was sort of more, you know, style than substance. From 90s to 2000, you see this renaissance of cocktail bars and cocktail bartenders, and all of a sudden, everyone started to look at it and go, cocktails are cool. 10, 20 years later, it's everywhere. Everyone's expected to make a good cocktail. And so when you look at the context of alcohol and you look at its long past with humanity, you realize that it's something that has a special status in our culture and in cultures past. And we're in not the golden age, we're in the platinum age.
Good evening. Tonight's program is one of many inspired by our exhibition, Spirited Republic, upstairs in the Lawrence O'Brien Gallery. If you haven't seen it yet, I urge you to return and have a look. To learn more about the fashions of this lively era, let's get right to our discussion.
We're thrilled to be here. We're talking about Prohibition-era fashion.
World War I was over and everyone just started to party.
I would have, certainly. Absolutely. So we have Charleston dancing near the Capitol. What's going on here?
Well, all these modern dances had already started before the war, but then they really took off in the 20s.
So during the war, people felt that they needed to exercise some restraint.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
You had to welcome the boys home, too, when they came back. In Atlantic City, as you know, the whole business with bathing suits caused a huge scandal. They were arresting people for wearing bathing suits that didn't have a long enough skirt and gals who were not wearing stockings.
What? Stockings with the bathing suit?
Right. So there was one woman from California.
And a corset, too?
Well, only the older ones were wearing the corset and the long dress, but the younger ones were wearing things like this. But it had to be long enough. It couldn't be without the skirt. The Annette Kellerman style got them arrested. And it was so unjust because while they're arresting people for wearing this on the beach, they're having these commercial beauty boardwalk festivals where the girls are strutting back and forth in the Annette Kellerman skirtless bathing suits with no stockings or stockings rolled all the way down, but that made money for all of the boardwalk executives.
Isn't it interesting, though, for all of us to look at this and reflect upon where we used to be and think of where we are today? I mean, I'd like to arrest a few people today. I don't mind at all. That's fascinating.
Well, they did have a few conflicts with men, too, because
what were the male conflicts?
Well, the men wore a bathing suit, which was briefs, but also a top. And once in a while, some daring person would take off the top, and he could be arrested for that.
Good heavens. Well, I'll say about myself The only way that I'll go to the beach is if I'm in what is it called? A Victorian bathing tent? That's the only way still. And some menswear.
Oh, yes, we had fun with the menswear. I mean, again, it was like we were, determined not to do the black and white sepia version of menswear. And in particular, we were dealing with the dynamic of sort of shifty characters who were coming newly into wealth and were very much about presentation. They, our Nucky, when he walked on the boardwalk, he wanted everybody to know that he was on the boardwalk. So we dressed him appropriately. And this is Chalky White, who is sort of the black counterpart to Nucky. Photography and film were both so huge, so people were much more conscious of their image and presenting an image, and that it was actually going to be documented. So with Nucky, we always made sure that he was presentable and ready to be,
I think these clothes are great.
These are really great.
Yeah. Thank you.
The menswear is also amazing. We tend to forget that, but it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, again, that speaks to the young men coming back from the war and just not wanting to have anything to do with the older generation.
It's so different than Edwardian. It's much stiffer and more
color.
uptight, and this is just so
exuberant.
Exuberant, exactly.
Yeah.
So that is our look back at the 20s with Valerie and John, and we're going to have a little fashion show.
Yes, hurrah!
Our first model this evening is Andy. Andy, come on out. So Andy is wearing an early 1920s mid-lightweight salmon-colored herringbone tweed suit. And this suit is comprised of a single-breasted jacket with patch pockets and matching plus fours. Plus fours are a variation on knickers and are comprised of a 4-inch fold over the knee. Knickerbockers or knickers were popular sportswear for many young gentlemen. The suit was made by Marley Clothes and tailored by the Syracuse Clothing Company. And also, this suit was used during season 4 of Boardwalk Empire, and it's part of Andy's own personal collection. Thank you, Andy. So Lori Crandall, come on out. Lori is wearing this absolutely remarkable casual day dress in silk crepe from 1922. It's adorned with fuchsia panels with colorful peasant-type hand-stitched embroidery in shades of lilac, Victorian rose, and marine blue with metallic gold accents. It's also been paired with original 20s silk-seamed stockings. I don't know how they survived either, Lori. And an early 1920s wide-brimmed straw and silk beaded hat with grosgrain ribbon appliques. And this hat was made by the Heart of Paris. Quite extraordinary, isn't it? Thank you, Lori.
Hi, I'm Gerald Alston of the Manhattans, and on this special day, I'd like to sing this special song and a shout out to Miss Sharon Nelson. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. It's been too hard living, but I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's up there beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. Then I go to my brother, and I said, brother, help me please. But he winds up knocking me back down on my knees. And oh, there have been times that I thought I couldn't last for long. But now I think I'm able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes it will. God bless.
I lived in Detroit, Michigan, in the city on the west side of Detroit. My mother took me to see Dr. King in Detroit as well as here in Washington, D.C. August 28, 1963 was my 12th birthday.
The buzz on the March on Washington started buzzing about a month beforehand. And as a beginning freelance, I did a lot of work for USIA, and this job came along. The caveat was that I would get paid twice my day rate, but they would own the negatives for the National Archives. I said, okay, that's fine. Not knowing at the time that this was going to be one of the great historical moments of U.S. history.
Part of our job as the archives is to accession, preserve, and make available records created by federal agencies. One of the roles of the USIA was kind of document what America was all about, to project a view of the United States overseas to foreign countries during the Cold War.
And I was 26 or 27 years old and very spry and very athletic, and I climbed over everything and went everywhere, and I photographed close-ups, long shots. I worked pretty hard that day.
Okay, and what I'm going to do now is take the folder out with the photos in it. These are the photos of the March on Washington.
Okay.
And this is a copy of your folder, the photo here.
I learned about the photo about 2.5 years ago. My cousin was browsing a catalog, and it had calendars in it, one of which was a Black History calendar. She saw my pic, and she called and said, your picture's on a calendar. So I was just in shock, and I still am.
She was on one of the front row of the crowd on sort of the left side of where Martin Luther King made that speech. And I see some people laughing and some people crying and some people earnest. And she was one of the ones, not only was she beautiful, but she was so involved.
This is the banner that I held August 28, 1963, that I proudly held up as Dr. King and others were speaking. I tell my grandchildren that marching with Dr. King was a very significant part of my life. As they learn about him in school, they can share with their classmates that their grandmother was part of something that was very important.
Her picture was used and has been used since then as the face of the March on Washington. She deserves it.
This is for the grandmothers, the great-grandmothers, the mothers, and others. I am excited because we are actually going to have Juneteenth. The virus is not stopping us, and this is what's going to happen. We are going to walk. I'm leading the walk from downtown Fort Worth out Lancaster to Will Rogers facility. That's 2.5 miles. And you know that symbolizes that slaves didn't know they were free for 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So don't want you walking, I want you to get in your car and follow me. Have signs on your car that said Juneteenth on either side, and have one on the top, because there's going to be a drone that's going to take all this in. The reason we celebrate Juneteenth was the gains. Are you aware that you couldn't name yourself or your children on property of any kind? You couldn't go to school if you didn't. Somebody taught you something, you were in danger of the two of you being killed. There are so many reasons why you need to celebrate Juneteenth. Thank you, Fort Worth ISD. I am asking that you continue to support us. And one of the things we need is for classroom teachers, librarians, and all of them to make the children aware and to have in their libraries and the classrooms the story of Juneteenth. Juneteenth, a children's story.
Boys think they can play sports better than girls, but I don't think that's true. And like in the old days, the men would go out and get the jobs, and the women would have to stay home and do all the housework and stuff. And I don't think that was fair either. That's the way it was. I couldn't help it.
My dear brother Silas, today began like any other day. The sun rose over the fields, lighting my sweet family's way to wakefulness. I prepared breakfast, tidied the house, took up my sewing, and gathered the children for our ride into town. My Sarah runs around like a little savage and does not want to wear any of the lovely dresses I make for her. I counted the blessings the good Lord bestowed on me and tried to remain calm while getting them ready.
See you. Okay, now go.
But all of this I accomplished with much impatience and an eye toward the clock. For a most out-of-the-ordinary event was to take place at 10 o'clock at the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. It was a convention for the discussion of the rights of women. My dear friend and neighbor Ann Dewey showed me the notice in the newspaper. Oh, now I can see you raise your eyebrow and give me your stern look. And I beg you not to disapprove of me. But a public meeting for women is such a curiosity. And my beloved husband, Mr. Griswold, did not forbid it. So I made up my mind to go. I am only slightly anxious about letting Mr. Griswold take care of our children and our home for the next 2 days. Your loving sister, Lucy.
years earlier, Lucretia Mott, a Quaker leader who had already earned a reputation for speaking out for the rights of slaves and women, traveled to London as a delegate to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. At the convention, Mott met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a newlywed who was there on her honeymoon with her husband Henry, also a delegate. Mott and the other women delegates caused an uproar on the convention floor. The entire first day, the men debated, not about the evils of slavery, but whether women should be permitted to participate. Finally, it was decided that they could remain silent in the gallery. The humiliation of this experience forged a lifelong bond between Mott and Stanton. They vowed to expand the crusade for women's rights after their return to America.
My dearest sister Lucy, you will be pleased to hear of my new position. I now have full responsibility for managing the mill. However, my increased duties have not kept me from doing my work against slavery. I was a little confused by your letter. What did you mean by women's rights? I have just returned from a church meeting where we were given more accounts about the terrible conditions of the slaves. They have no freedom or rights. Don't women already have rights? Men must work very hard to provide their wives with a home and security and to support their children. What more could women desire? Your friend Anne was always strong-minded, even when we were children. I'm surprised her husband still tolerates her. He must be a saint or too old and feeble to control her. Have I not told you that what men most prize in a woman is her affection? My Martha understands this, and it is truly the success of our marital bliss. I urge you to follow her ways. Your brother, Silas.
In the summer of 1848, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton joined Mary Ann McClintock, Martha Wright, and Jane Hunt for afternoon tea in Waterloo, New York. Stanton, no longer infatuated with being a homemaker, recalled her feelings on that day. I poured out the torrent of my long accumulating discontent with such vehemence and indignation that I stirred myself, as well as the rest of the party, to do and dare anything. They decided to call the first Women's Rights Convention.
What a very good idea. We need some kind of a document that will set forth exactly how we feel about these things. Are you reading?
One week later, they met at the home of Mary Ann McClintock to discuss a plan for presenting their grievances.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
They chose as their model the document which had brought charges against the King of England, the Declaration of Independence. Women called their document the Declaration of Sentiments, and it would indict an entire society.
Therefore, it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you my dear friend, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed... that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. He has withheld from her rights.
This is election day, and my brother is 21 years old. How proud he seemed as he dressed up in his best Sunday clothes and drove off in the big wagon with father and the hired men to vote. I turned to Mary and I said, "Wouldn't you like to vote as well as Oliver? Don't you and I love the country just as well as he, and doesn't the country need our ballots?" Then she looked scared, but answered, "Of course we do, and of course we ought, but don't you go ahead and say so, for then we would be called strong-minded."
He has taken from her all right in property, even to the wages she earns. He has made her morally.
I have earned enough to school me a while, and have I not a right to do so? Or must I go home like a dutiful girl, place the money in father's hands, and then there goes all my hard earnings?
In the covenant of marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, he becoming to all intents and purposes her master. The law giving him power to deprive her.
As the Lord Christ is the head of the church and the head of the man, so is the man the head and governor of the woman. This is God's choice and should not be transgressed.
He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. He allows her in church as well as state, but a subordinate position.
Our colleges were never intended for the education of females. The male brain weighs more than the female brain. This proves that women are intellectually inferior and should be educated for different purposes.
He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action, when that belongs to her conscience and to her God.
I felt that I had found my vocation. I forgot God and did not know it, forgot philosophy and did not care to remember it. But alas, I forgot to get Bard's dinner. Not only once did I do this, but again and again. The fire went out or the bread ran over in the pans while I painted and dreamed. Had the passion seized me before marriage, no other love could have come between me and art. But I felt that it was too late, as my life was already devoted to another object: housekeeping.
He has endeavored, in every way that he could, to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life.
Dear Silas, you sound more like father than father did when he was alive. I must confess, I am confused by all this talk of women's rights. My heart is inflamed as much with a fearful anxiety as it is stirred with new ideas. I never expected to see women speaking so eloquently and with such power in public. Yes, dear Silas, they spoke like men, or even better. Yet, I know I'm very happy in my own home with my wonderful children and loving husband. But what about my lovely Sarah? Should she stay home like I did while her brothers go off to college? Shouldn't a man want a woman who can think and is well educated to be his companion and raise his children? Your loving sister, Lucy. P.S. No need to fear, Silas. I have not signed any declaration. I could not be sure how Mr. Griswold would feel, so I held back. Oh, and by the way, Anne didn't sign either.
300 people attended the Convention for Women's Rights in Seneca Falls. Of these, 68 women and 32 men signed the Declaration of Sentiments, including the African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. This gathering demonstrated to those women unhappy with their status that they were not alone, and it proclaimed to the world that here were women and men willing to change the conditions and injustices which oppressed them. They knew their path would not be easy.
My dear Lucy, I urge you not to look away from your own little family circle for the means of producing moral and social reforms. You can be a guiding light within your home and should not participate in public demonstrations.
Amy, come back here.
Amy, don't want to keep playing with us. Back with your mother on the blanket, okay?
I pray you still believe that women are far superior to men morally. That is why it is your duty to instill your children with those values our dear departed mother taught us. Your loving brother, Silas.
What do the ladies want? They have the best place and choicest titbit at the table. They have the best seat in the cars, carriages, and sleighs. And at the present time, with the prevailing fashion, one lady occupies 3 times as much space in the world as a gentleman. If there is any inequality or oppression in the case, the gentlemen are the sufferers.
Little did the critics and newspapermen realize that the negative attention they gave to the first Women's Rights Convention served to spread the flames of discontent to others. The issues, now hotly debated in the public arena, could no longer be ignored.
This meeting, as I understand it, was called to discuss women's rights. Well, I do not pretend to know exactly what women's rights are, but I do know that I have grown for 40 years, yea, for 50 years, under a sense of women's wrongs.
As far as marriages, well, my mom, she's a teacher and she works also, so does my dad. But she quit working for a while to stay home with us until my brother was in kindergarten and we were old enough to stay home alone and everything. And she had to put her career on hold. My dad could have done that too, I think.
But I would expect to, have her own profession, like I would have mine. And though I would expect the food to be on the table at the same time, So it's got to balance out on that.
You see how all the basketball games for boys, they always get on TV and the Dream Team and all that. But for girls, I mean, what do they get? They hardly get any recognition,
Well, they had a Dream Team for girls.
Yeah, but nobody really paid attention to them.
Yeah, they did.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did.
No, they didn't.
Yeah, they did.
No, they did not.
Mm-hmm.
No, don't tell me. They did not pay attention.
In the eyes of the law made by men, women were classified with minors, lunatics, and idiots. They could not own property, make contracts, sue, or serve on juries. A woman was only one husband away from poverty.
Dear Silas, I write with a sad heart the news of Uncle Edward's death. Unbeknownst to Aunt Grace, he had deeply encumbered himself in debt, and the creditors have claimed everything. Now she must leave the very house which her father gave to her. It frightens me to think that a woman who loses her husband may become destitute in an instant. What if something were to happen to Mr. Griswold? And who would take care of us? I shouldn't permit myself to think such thoughts. I must confide in you that I will do everything in my power to secure a good education for Sarah, so she can be independent and realize her own self-worth. We have stopped buying sugar produced by slaves. It is my small way of helping the cause. Love, Lucy.
Dearest Lucy, I will miss Uncle Edward. He was always so much fun to be with, although he helped himself too much to the bottle. Surely Aunt Grace was aware of his drinking and financial extravagances. Perhaps Aunt Grace will remarry and thereby ensure the security of her family. Husbands are the best protection from poverty, even though they are not immortal. My boys are shooting up like cornstalks. I urge them to study hard so they can earn a living and support me when I'm too old to earn any more. My work keeps me so occupied that I worry that I do not spend enough time with them, although I do not know how much time they want to spend with me. Martha is still frail from the birth of Joshua. She looks forward to spending some time with you. Your loving brother, Silas.
The common experience of childbirth and child rearing bound most women together. They spent much of their adult lives pregnant, giving birth, nursing, recovering from births, and supporting their female kin and friends.
By God's grace, I have given birth to 10 children before my 34th year, and though 4 of them have not survived, I am still alive. With God's grace again, I will give life to this one, and he will not take mine. I pray that Jonathan will not take an interest in me again. I cannot bear much more.
Dear Silas, today is Sarah's 16th birthday. Where, my dear brother, do the years go? Sarah is very involved with herself. Oh, I know the stage will pass, but sometimes, she is impossible to be with. I took her to town to buy material for a silk dress. Her ideas about fashion differed from mine.
How about this one here? Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hoskins.
We passed a woman wearing blues. I must say they are not very flattering to the hips. I told Sarah that I would relish the freedom of movement they give. Sarah declared that if I wore such a scandalous outfit, I wouldn't be welcome to visit her at school or tell anyone I was her mother.
My dear sister, mark my words, if women insist on wearing those vulgar fashions, the next thing you know, we will see them smoking tobacco. It is fortunate that your Sarah has not inherited her mother's radical notions. She will need to attract a level-headed young man for her husband, and no healthy member of the masculine sex would ever be attracted to a woman in bloomers. On a more serious note, I am daily more concerned about the great rift that grows between the North and South. I know that Eli is worried over whether he will be able to keep the factory running. So much talk of war that I fear for all our sons and our country. Your loving brother, Silas.
That's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about. He can laugh.
When the Civil War came, women kept the farms producing and the factories running. They donned nurses' caps and marched to the battlefields to heal the wounded. They taught the children and kept the home fires burning. The leaders of the women's movement led the campaign for the passage of a constitutional amendment which would free the slaves. Women expected equal rights for the slaves and themselves after the war.
My dearest Martha, the sadness wells up in me as I write to you about the great loss we share with the death of my dear brother Silas. I hear very little from Eli and my sons. I have been comforted with Sarah's presence as she awaits the return of her husband. While we don't always hold the same opinions, we manage to have lengthy discussions to fill our lonely hours. Once the slaves are free, I believe the Negroes must have the vote to protect themselves from any more abuses. Sarah says that women must also get the right to vote. She feels if women would have a say in the laws of the land, then there would be no wars. Maybe she's right. I still feel that even if we have a say, who would listen to our voices? Martha, am I just growing old and tired? I wish we could be together now. With loving comfort, Lucy.
When the war ended, most abolitionists supported a constitutional amendment giving African American men the right to vote. They refused, however, to include a woman's right to vote, fearing it would be too controversial and would defeat their cause. This decision created a major split between those woman suffrage advocates willing to put their desires on the back burner and those unwilling to wait any longer for the basic civil rights of all women. The seed planted 20 years earlier in Seneca Falls still had not blossomed.
See, girls always put you down. Yeah, you always put us down. Not all the time. Not all the time? Well, see, look, you just put me down right there. Well, you're yelling at me for putting you down, when you put me down, so it doesn't really matter. So both girls and boys say that, but it still means that girls are treated differently than boys. Yeah, true. Have you ever seen a girl president? No. Have you ever seen, It'll never happen.
I don't think it'll ever become equal. Just.
I think it will. I think it will.
Unless we lose gender, it'll never.
See, he still thinks he has all the power, and it's not.
No, I'm not saying that men are overpowered. I just don't think it'll ever be totally equal.
I think it will.
My dearest Sarah, at 40, I know you feel you are too old to take advice from your dear old mother. But at my age, I feel I have earned the right to speak my mind about your daughter and my granddaughter. I sense that you and Charles are afraid that Hannah will be criticized and ridiculed if she enters the medical profession. I hope you will accept this money as my modest investment in Hannah's future. If your father were alive, he would have wanted this too. We must make sure our daughters have the same opportunities as our sons. I'm afraid I won't be around much longer to see all the changes that are yet to come. And yet, I can't help but think about how far we've come since that remarkable day in 1848, and how much of the road is still left to travel. Your loving mother.
The Constitution is a living document. It is not static. As citizens, we need to make it real, not just for some of us, but for all of us. The phrase "with liberty and justice for all" mean all. We're one people. We're one family. We're the American family.
The discovery of an individual's liberty is one of the foundational values of being an American citizen. America has been struggling to define the rights and justices associated with that liberty since the creation of its Constitution. From this struggle evolved the monumental Bill of Rights and 17 more amendments to define and protect our liberties. Over time, the amendment process has been tested by a nation whose national sense of liberty, equality, and the inclusion of all citizens evolved with turbulence and struggle.
When we were planning the March on Washington in August of 1963, I would hear Dr. King say things like, "We must learn to live together as brothers and sisters. If not, we will perish as fools."
Freedom, true freedom, is not given by governments. Freedom is taken by the people. The people of America are becoming aware that this freedom to their fellow human beings, and I call them human rights, are theirs to give.
The issues that compel America to continue to define equality and fairness, I think it's innate. I really believe that it's in our soul, that we believe in freedom, freedom of the individual. We believe that humans have a right to peacefully coexist with fellow human beings.
So there are two monumental statues on the Pennsylvania Avenue side of the National Archives building. One inscribed, "Study the past," the other, "What is past is prologue." The message is, we should be able to learn from our history so that we're not repeating the same mistakes over and over. And the role of the National Archives is to ensure that people have access to the records that demonstrate how those rights were achieved so that we can learn from those records.
With over 11,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution, and only 27 of those actually ratified, our pursuit of rights and justice continues to be a vibrant part of our democracy. It's up to every generation of Americans to own our democracy and continue this national dialogue of defining our personal liberties.
It is very, very important for all of us as citizens, for all of us as one people, to take ownership of our system of justice. This is our democracy. It belongs to all of us. We must talk about it. We must debate it. We have to continue to fight every single day. If we do not, we will go backward. We don't want to go backward. We want to go forward and complete our effort to create a more perfect union.
I wonder how you all, if you could talk a little bit about how you all came to have your individual passions, your passions for individual freedom, and the concerns that we're really here to talk about today.
I'm lucky to have been here for a very long time. I won't say how long, because then you're going to look at me and go, really? But I've been here a long time and came up, started as a very enthusiastic volunteer, actually, and ended up working on individual cases of human rights violations. And then I got to work with President and Mrs. Carter. And I had lived overseas. I'd lived in Zaire, now the Congo, and understood how important it was what President Carter achieved with putting human rights at the front of foreign policy. So I think for today's conversation, I think what I'm feeling the urge to talk about is to build on what the conversation was that they had, which was, where are we on our journey for human rights? Because civil rights, as we understand it, is very specific to participation, access to participation in civic life. And we have in recent years been looking at because not only that we have strong women and President Carter and Mrs. Carter feel strongly about it, but this is an area where human beings, half of the planet, are actually not full human beings in the way we live. Even in this country, we never were able to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Women in this country do not enjoy the equal protection of law. And so when we have victims of violence, they are not protected by the law in the same way that men are.
I was able to see how the definition of human sometimes is actually the real root of the problem when you're talking about human rights. Whose rights are we protecting? And in cases, for example, like Thailand, oftentimes the people most often trafficked are young girls from hill tribes. They're not citizens, they don't have any paperwork, so they're not protected by the state and they're not considered human. And I think you could apply that to pretty much every situation, whether it's refugees without paperwork or people living in poverty here in the United States or in Atlanta.
The necessity for any movement to advance, it had to resolve the internal contradictions. And to the extent that those internal contradictions were not resolved, then you would have a continuation of problems such that a particular kind of movement would not succeed in this effort. So let's expand on that and apply it to this national project that we see here in these United States of America. So there has been this discussion, a conversation in a sense, about freedom and human rights. But there needs to be, I think, a conversation about the conversation, right, that gets to one of our internal contradictions, which is this capacity, and I think it came out in President Carter's comments early on in his interview, where we almost have this juxtaposition of being able to proclaim with pride the values, the exceptionalism that define, again, this American experience, right? And at the same time, refuse to grapple with the contradictions that defy those proclamations that we make about ourselves.
Getting people, one, to step out of their comfort zones, and whether it's taking a tour of different part of town or different neighboring state, let alone if you go overseas, do you really want to take time off the beach to go and visit an orphanage and see what the struggles are and how you can help? Because sometimes it's something as simple as $20 that a girl needs a birth certificate, just the paperwork processed so that she can enroll in school. And that $20 that you would have spent in 2 or 3 days at Starbucks could go a long way towards allowing someone's whole entire life outlook to be different.
We started because of an injustice for a little girl who was 10 years old. We shared that rhetoric, much like they did in the civil rights era of the 60s, with everyone we could come into contact with in community, on our jobs. And then they rallied with us. And then there were hundreds of us speaking on behalf of that child who was once voiceless. And then we took that voice and we went to legislatures and we said laws must be changed. And there wasn't just 1, 2, 3, 4. There were thousands of us across this state of Georgia. And that moved us to work in concert with people we would normally not work in concert with. We worked in concert with men and Republicans and Democrats and independents and people who didn't think like us but knew that there was an injustice, and together we could do something of those. That materialized on May 5th, 2015, with the governor here signing the historic Safe Harbor Rachel's Law into act. That's a direct correlation back to the 60s and the civil rights movement. We just took a page book because we didn't have to reinvent that.
I wondered if you all could talk about social media and how this has impacted the work that you do. If it's facilitated it, if there are things in social media that make this work more difficult, what the net balance of it is.
Depending on, again, the concreteness, we have to make those decisions of the proper instruments based on the realities. And I'm not sure if we're having those conversations. Maybe it's our challenges in the kind of intergenerational transfer of technology, intergenerational transfer of movement that we have that conversation. And maybe it's our fault or previous generations' fault for not having this dialogue with our young people and those who proclaim to use social media in the context of movement. Maybe they're just reaching out and grabbing what's there in the absence of that discussion.
If you turn on the news, all you're really going to hear about is Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And if you're like me, sometimes you just want to put that on mute. And it's easier to go over to social media and see what else is happening in the world and what else is happening in our state that is not being covered because it's not getting as many ratings. And so it puts the news outlet in the power of people and activists and, you know, to your point, younger people, which Carter said there won't be any change without, so.
That's right.
FDR mastered the radio and got the public. JFK mastered the TV and got the public. And Donald Trump has mastered social media and is accelerating with using this. It was a really good point, I thought, because I think there's a caution that we can't dismiss it. We can't dismiss its power. We know that ISIS and Daesh and these groups are using it very effectively, so we can't be naive about it. We have to know it, we have to understand it and how to use it. I think we do have to understand, though, that the civil rights movement succeeded because they had a strategy. They had meetings, they had people meeting face to face.
What about this work makes you hopeful? If you're trying to appeal to people, say this is what you should do, what is it you see that gives you that hope that things can change and that the progress can be made?
I see it when we've rescued 13 boys and they said, thank you for rescuing us, even though we're not a girl, that you saw us. I see it when we'll go to the polls this November on November 8th, and we have the opportunity to vote for Senate Resolution 7, the funding mechanism, the constitutional amendment here in Georgia that will fund the services and the resources for children. Me, when my baby girl says, I have a job, Ms. Williams, and no one is tricking me out anymore.
We have to have hope in the work that you're doing, and because it's almost like it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about, right? And there are this great work that you are doing and others to provide services to people who are trapped in what we can call slavery, right? And there are whole jurisdictions where they have adopted a comprehensive approach. In Sweden, they passed a law 15 years ago that sees people who are trapped in the sex trade, child or adult.
That's right.
And says, we know that this would not be a choice that any person would make if they had other options.
And I think the real way in which you can alleviate the pressure for organizations to pop up and save and recuperate and rehabilitate young girls and boys is for there to be other opportunities. And keeping kids in school is a huge piece of that, which is why all of the organizations always emphasize a component on staying in school education, helping girls finish at least K through 12.
Young people in Ferguson and other types of responses to some of the dynamics that we see unfolding in front of our eyes, I think they demonstrated a certain level of courage, which said that we are prepared to proclaim for ourselves that this is our movement and it's our time. And that's what I think gives me hope. Not that young people are moving, because again, to kind of complete the circle, young people are always moving, they're always responding in some kind of way to challenge what they see to be the distasteful or injustices of their time. But what I think I see happening now is that they're prepared to do so with a certain sense of courage, a certain sense of clarity.
Most people think they can't engage in human rights in their everyday lives. How can you guide us to be more involved in our thinking about thinking about and advocating for human rights?
Really think within yourself, what do you care about? Pick something that just really talks to your heart, and really dive in and go in for the long term. You know, try not to just dabble. You know, dabble until you find the thing. But human rights needs us all because it's actually quite in danger.
I have learned that when I save one male, I generally, on average, save 3 to 4 girls. because he will not go to try to profit off of her body. When I can put him in school, in a classroom, give him a support system, the mentors that are necessary, counseling if that's required as well, housing, food, and a part-time or full-time job, then he doesn't see it as a necessary evil for him to go and prostitute another girl, or sell another girl.
There's a reason why all the great religions of the world have explicit reference to how one treats strangers. Because left to our own devices, we will hit the stranger over the head with the club. But we have to have these parables, and we have to have these surahs, and we have to have these religious edicts that tell us, don't hit the stranger over the head with the club, see the stranger as your brother and your sister. And hopefully after enough socialization to actually we begin to look at the world this way.
We are in Saratoga Springs celebrating the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote, very close to where that movement all started.
My name's Elena. What's your name? My name is Michaela. Good. Thank you. You too.
Women are coming together to really celebrate our empowerment, the right to vote, and map out a plan for the future.
This conference, more than any other conference I've been involved in, brings together an incredibly diverse group of people that are eager to talk to each other and eager to listen to each other.
Begins, and I was in the first graduating class.
All right!
Yeah.
So this is a photo of my great-great-grandmother. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Young women feel empowered today because if they look backwards, they'll find out that they're standing on the shoulders of the women's movement, and that men and women have worked very hard to create opportunities for them. For 6 years, we've been working on breaking the bronze ceiling over Central Park, and we're putting the first statue of real women in the park. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth.
That's wonderful.
They all fought for women's rights. Ceiling. And whether it's in your office space, whether it's in an inappropriate relationship there, whether you check and find out that you're being paid less for the same job, you either accept it or you do something about it to change it.
History isn't what happened, it's who tells the story. We're moving away from the great white men, great wars, great dates history. And that requires that we repopulate history with all of the voices. Then we begin to know what we're celebrating, what we're commemorating. It was not a perfect movement. These women pushed democracy forward, but they did it at the expense sometimes of African American and other women of color. They made the argument, give women the vote, because white, native-born women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. How many years have we not had the multiplicity of voices that it takes to make good decisions that are in the interest of everyone?
I love the dresses.
Isn't it amazing what they've done with the hair?
In the 19th century, there was a burgeoning of all kinds of experimentation, esoteric religions, there was spiritualism, there was theosophy. This new religious voice opened the door for women's that then gave them the tools so that they then could organize women for the vote. It was really about thinking about your own calling, your own conscience. Women's freedom of conscience was connected to women's liberty, and women's liberty was also connected to the anti-slavery movement.
In April of 1888, he was giving a speech in Washington, D.C. He was reflecting on his time in Seneca Falls in 1848. He said, "When I ran away from slavery, I did it for myself. When I fought for abolition, I did it for my people. But when I was at Seneca Falls and fought for women's rights, there was some nobility in that act." Frederick Douglass was definitely for universal suffrage. And so he understood the importance of the vote to elevate his people, but also to protect his people from being brutalized, dehumanized, and lynched. And when I think about what Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and what they were up against, imagine living at a time when your federal government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you. Your government is saying that. I think that many people would run away from that challenge, and thank goodness he and many others didn't, or we would be a very different country today.
Driving to the 19th Amendment. Use it. We will. For so long, we have just been consumers of technology and not the producers. We must insist that in every arena, in every boardroom where technology decisions are made, that women have voice. What would happen if all of these voices could come together to unify behind issues that are important to women and then work together in order to find solutions, either through our legislations or through our own sources of empowerment. These are the early suffragists striving for freedom. Sarah Breedlove, slave-born. Don't sit down and wait for opportunities to come. Get up and make them. Thank you, Sarah Breedlove, McWilliams Davis Walker.
As women, elevating our voices, what do you think would be our goal within the next, let's say, election cycle?
We talk a lot about gender parity, and I think that means all women have accurate representation in all legislative bodies. And so I'm completely behind the energy to get more Republican women in Congress, to get more unaffiliated and independent women and more women of color, because I think it's really only when people see themselves in government that the government really can thrive.
And we need to galvanize the inspiration of our young people, our girls, our young women, to be better, to have ambition, to demand more.
Starting this fall 2019, there will be 19.2 million college students in this country. Out of those, more than 11 million, a little more, 11.2, are women. If all these young ladies, these women, went out and voted, then we would see men and women in office who represent what matters to us as women. We're going to have our reproductive rights protected. We're going to have equal pay. We're going to have childcare.
Keep on representing, baby. We're going to ignite their minds.
Ignite their minds.
Their passion.
Their passions.
Let them feel it, understand it, explore it.
Thank you all for joining us here in the theater, and for those of you who are joining us through C-SPAN or on YouTube. We're happy to have all of you join in this evening's program. I'm Jim Gardner, the Executive for Legislative Archives, Presidential Libraries, and Museum Services here at the Archives, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome you tonight on behalf of David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States. Today has been Magna Carta Day here at the Archives. We've been celebrating the 800th anniversary of the day in 1215, when King John of England agreed to a charter aimed at making peace between him and a group of barons who were in rebellion. Magna Carta established that no one, not even the monarch, is above the law, and everyone has a right to the law. These principles inspired our nation's founding fathers when they crafted our founding documents, the Charters of Freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights that are in the rotunda above us. Also on display here at the archives is a very rare copy of the 1297 Magna Carta. It greets you when you visit our Records of Rights exhibit. As you came in tonight into the archives, it was right ahead of you, not lit up because the gallery's closed tonight, but I hope you'll come back and see our copy of Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is part of an exhibit called Records of Rights in the David M. Rubenstein Gallery. Mr. Rubenstein provided support for the gallery and even put his copy of Magna Carta on permanent display there. Tonight, we have a panel of Magna Carta scholars who will explore the ties between this historic document and how we live today. However, before we go any further, I'd like to tell you about a couple of evening programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. This Friday, June 19, at 7 p.m., Cox Guggenheim Symposium pays tribute to documentary filmmaker Stanley Nelson, whose films on the African American experience have received wide acclaim. The program is being presented by the AFI Docs Documentary Film Festival in partnership with the Charles Guggenheim Center for Documentary Film here at the National Archives. Then on Thursday, June 25th at 7 p.m., we'll have a panel discussing D.C. statehood and the current state of our representative democracy. The panel will include former Washington, D.C. Mayor Anthony Williams, D.C. Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton, and former New York Congressman Jim Walsh. The program is being presented in partnership with the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. If you want to know more about upcoming events here and all our public programs, calendar are in the lobby, along with the sign-up sheet to be included if you want to be included on our mailing list for the calendar, either by regular mail or email. Another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports the work of the archives, especially our education and outreach programs, such as tonight's. You can pick up an application for membership in the lobby or become a member online at archivesfoundation.org. Tonight's program, getting back to tonight's program, will be a discussion of the influence of Magna Carta on American constitutionalism, including its place in the charters of the American colonies, its impact on our founding era, and its continued influence today. This program is presented in partnership with the Constitutional Sources Project, also known as ConSource, and we thank them for their support. The project is a nonprofit devoted to educating lawyers, judges, teachers, students, and the general public about American constitutional history. And with us tonight to open the program is the Executive Director of ConSource, Julie Silverbrook. Julie holds a law degree from the College of William and Mary and a bachelor's degree in political science from the George Washington University. Now, to introduce tonight's panel, please welcome Julie Silverbrook.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Jim. As Jim mentioned, I'm Julie Silverbrook, Executive Director of the Constitutional Sources Project, or ConSource. All right, we're good? Okay. that's all right. Okay, everybody can hear me now? All right, let's try that again. I'm still Julie Silverbrook, and I'm still the Executive Director of the Constitutional Sources Project, or ConSource. For short, we're an organization devoted to facilitating greater access to and understanding of U.S. constitutional history, and it is an absolute pleasure to join the National Archives this evening to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the sealing of Magna Carta. Magna Carta has left a profound legacy for law and culture around the world. To commemorate Magna Carta and its powerful ideas, like trial by jury and due process of law embodied in its text, we have assembled an impressive group of scholars to discuss Magna Carta's influence on American constitutionalism. Tonight we will be joined by Jennifer Paxton, a medieval specialist from Catholic University of America, Robert Polito, author of In the Shadow of the Great Charter, who I heard gave a wonderful lecture this afternoon, and Bruce O'Brien, a Magna Carta expert from the University of Mary Washington. Tonight's program will be live tweeted on the ConSource Twitter page, live streamed on the National Archives YouTube page, and I'm told that C-SPAN is also here with us this evening. I hope folks joining us at home and around the world will tune in online and on social media. And with that, I now have the great privilege of welcoming to the stage our expert panelists, as well as our distinguished moderator, Judge Royce Lamberth, Senior United States District Judge for the District of Columbia. Please join me in welcoming them. And with that, I'm going to hand the reins over to our very capable, distinguished moderator, Judge Lamberth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. It's a pleasure to be here at the Archives. As you know, it was 800 years ago today that a group of English barons forced King John to sign a charter known as Magna Carta with the idea that the king's capacity to kill or imprison should not be exercised at his whim, but that he should have explicit constraints, that is, that he would be subject to law, and that neither force nor detention would be used against a free man except in accordance with the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Those are the words from that 1215 version of the Magna Carta. You'll hear a lot tonight about the impact Magna Carta has had in this country, in both state constitutions and, of course, in the United States Constitution. Since England never adopted a constitution, in some ways the influence of Magna Carta is even greater in this country. Certainly the notions of due process of law and the right to jury trials have developed directly from Magna Carta, as well as separation of powers principles and judicial decision-making on what law is. Some of this is really fascinating historically, I hope you find tonight. For example, when the barons demanded a jury of their peers in Magna Carta, they certainly were not envisioning a jury of commoners. Their peers were clearly other barons. So some of their notions would be a surprise to them if they were here 800 years later and know how we interpret a jury of your peers to include mere commoners. But Magna Carta has become a rallying cry for centuries now regarding what the law of the land requires. And as we debate today current topics like whether the president can legally authorize drone strikes to kill American citizens, we hear citations to Magna Carta even today in legal debates about the power of our president. As many of you know, there was a great ceremony today at Runnymede to celebrate. Elizabeth was there, along with the archivist, David Ferriero, who is there instead of here, I'm sorry to say, but not sorry for him. I'm sure he had a great time. And many of my colleagues, the president of the American Bar Association, many of my other colleagues from the American Bar Association were there as well. I have to tell you one story about Runnymede, because when I was a student in law school, my last summer before I graduated from law school, I spent in Europe, traveling through Europe, and I decided when I was in England that I would go to Runnymede to see where the Magna Carta had been signed, the original version in 1215. The American Bar Association actually put up the memorial that is there. It was only put up in 1957. So the actual memorial with the plaque was erected in 1957. I hate to admit, but I was there in 1966 while I was still in law school. There was no pathway just in the middle of this field out at Runnymede, so I had hitchhiked up there. I had a Euro pass for traveling in Europe, but it wasn't good in England, so I had to hitchhike during the time I was in England, and I hitchhiked out to Runnymede, and I rode various rides to get up there, and I had my suitcase with me on Avon to see Shakespeare's production and to go to the Globe Theater after I left Runnymede. So I traipsed out there in the middle of this field and saw Runnymede and was somewhat dumbfounded there wasn't more of a production to this whole scene, and it was just in the middle of a field, this small memorial, and I trekked back, and as I'm getting back to go back to the highway, I start sliding down this hill. It was pouring down buckets of rain, sort of like when you came in tonight, only buckets of rain, and I slid down this hill. My suitcase came loose and slid down behind me and then on top of me. So I was really one muddy mess by the time I got to the highway. No one would stop and pick up this muddy mess. Eventually a lorry stopped and I was able to get in this lorry and get. I have a very vivid memory of Runnymede. So I'm really delighted to be able to participate in this program tonight. The New York Times headline yesterday read, "Magna Carta still posing a challenge at 800. In typical New York Times fashion, there's also an opinion piece yesterday entitled "Stop Revering Magna Carta" by a law professor from the University of Chicago, naturally. He decries some of the myths that have developed about Magna Carta. We will deal with some of those myths during our program tonight, but the National Archives is a very special place to have a discussion about Magna Carta because, as you just heard, the 1297 version of Magna Carta is on display here. I was in this very room the night that David Rubenstein was honored by the National Archives for obtaining, through an auction in New York, the only copy we have in America of the Magna Carta, and for presenting it to the archives so it could be on display. And the archivist, David Ferriero, introduced me to Mr. Rubenstein that night, and it was one of my great thrills in life to meet one of our real American heroes who's really doing something with the $1 billion he made to improve our life of all of us in this country, and certainly preserving the Magna Carta as one of our charters of freedom is something great he's done for this country, I think. So I think I want to stop talking to myself and get to our illustrious panel, and I will start as we do chronologically with asking Bruce and Jenny if they will give us, we'll start with Bruce, sort of a historical overview of the run-up to what happened in 1215, and then Jenny will talk more about the actual sealing of the Magna Carta itself in 1215. But Bruce, you want to start?
Well, thank you very much. As I was listening to your King John's, were not so dissimilar. So you could take some pleasure in that empathy. I am, as Julie said, a professor down at Mary Washington, but I'm also the academic lead and chair of the Literary Board of Early English Laws, which is a British state-funded project to publish, re-edit, and translate all early English law up to Magna Carta, including Magna Carta. And the reason I say that is because I think oftentimes people think here, and I don't blame them for it, that Magna Carta just springs from nowhere. Suddenly there's this medieval document that appears and it's very important, and there's not a lot of attention given to what came before, and also not a lot of attention given to what came after until it gets to the colonies, and then it does take on a very vibrant and different kind of life. But the texts that we do in the project, there are 150 of them, are in fact all legal texts that predate Magna Carta. So there's a very vibrant legal culture going on in England up to Magna Carta, and Magna Carta, from that perspective, is just part of it. It's not something out of the blue. It's not something so surprising as a legal text, a text where people try to hash out what they think the law should be. And instead of taking you through all of the weeds of those texts, which are a lot of fun, they're all online, they're all free, instead I'll just talk about, I think, something that leads up to Magna Carta that's quite important, and that is the relationship of monarchs to the law. And because Magna Carta itself is, I think, probably at its core, a rejection of tyranny. It's a statement that kings do not have absolute power, that there are checks on royal authority when royal behavior is bad, that these should be invoked. That is an old tradition, not spelled out with quite the same detail as in Magna Carta, but an old tradition in English law. And I think if you wanted to trace when monarchs really started to be, felt compelled to put promises in writing to their subjects that they will administer the law correctly, they will administer the law fairly, they want their judges to administer the law fairly. You're looking at the 10th century, Edgar, who's king of the end of the 10th century, who is a powerful king, and he is nevertheless someone who makes concessions. And one of them is he begins this practice of promising in his law codes to honor them, honor the very laws, and to not be abusive, not be a bad king. And that practice is followed by subsequent kings. The Scandinavian king, the Viking king who conquered England in the 11th century, Canute, actually creates probably a coronation oath, an oath the kings would take, promising to respect the laws of the land. And in his case, what he was made to promise as part of the deal by which he got England was to honor the laws of Edgar. So again, it's this backward-looking precedent. These are the good old laws, I will honor them. And you can follow that, hopping and skipping all the way up to Magna Carta, even over the Norman conquest in 1066. A dynasty, to call it foreign is wrong because they're cousins. But William the Conqueror fights a battle, kills the king, Harold, and takes over the kingdom. It's always a mistake to have a very centralized government. When they fall very fast. And for hundreds of years, scholars have tried to sort out, what happened. And one of the things I think that is interesting in terms of Magna Carta that happens is you see people taking a lot of pains to try to ensure that people feel comfortable that there's been a continuity of law and political power over the conquest, whether rightly or wrongly, whether that reflects reality. They create a concept of the laws of Edward the Confessor. And each king after, from William on, promises to honor those laws. And those are the laws of the last English king. Now, they don't exist. There was no code issued by Edward. But this notion that the Golden Age had produced laws that all English kings should honor is there. And so there again, kings putting themselves under the law, hearing the law from the people, and then putting themselves under it. And so one aspect of Magna Carta is that. It's just that you have a king, in this case John, who is put, though the document is from him, so he's sort of saying, I'm happy to do this, but put under the law, and with a lot of safeguards in place in that first Magna Carta. The only other thing I'll add, and this I'll revisit later when we talk, I think, about some of the common misunderstandings of Magna Carta, is that you should keep in mind, with all these legal texts, it's still very hard to know whether any of them is actually official as we would think of a law as official, something that people would go to as a source or reference. There's just a lot of law floating around, and when you look at what happens to Magna Carta afterwards, people start to adjust it, edit it, merge versions of it. It's really very strange. And so I think we tend to see it as this document that appears, it has these rights, and it comes out of nowhere, and it has an influence. Well, there's a long lead up to it, and there is a different context for understanding it that should always sort of be there when we're trying to interpret what it actually meant to people of the time.
That's great. Jenny, you want to talk about how we actually did it?
Well, it's one thing for kings to promise when they're crowned to follow the law, and it's quite another thing for them to do it throughout their reign. And that's where effectively the rubber met the road with Magna Carta, because we come to a particular king, King John, And John is one of only 2 kings in English history never to have a successor named after him. So there's never been a John II, and I can confidently predict there never will be a John II. That name is definitely off the list. You know, think about when they name a new prince, what are the names in contention? Not John. Now, there really are 2 proximate causes for Magna Carta. One is a foreign policy disaster, and the other is the character of the king. And I would argue that without those 2 factors, we would not have had Magna Carta. So the foreign policy disaster. Bruce mentioned the Norman Conquest. What the Norman Conquest did was to make England a cross-channel empire. So they've got England, and then they've got lands on the continent that they still control. And that's Normandy, where William the Conqueror came from. But over the course of the 12th century, they acquired basically the whole western seaboard of France. So they own basically half of France, which is great for the English, not so good for the French. So there is a standing conflict between the French kingdom and the kings of England. And it is exacerbated by the weird sort of feudal situation that obtains between them, because those lands in France that the English control, they are held of the French king as fiefs. So the French king is actually the overlord of the English king in his capacity as Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, etc., etc. Now, this is really a false position for 2 kings to be in regard to each other, because the sovereignties conflict. But they haven't sorted that out in the 12th and 13th centuries. And so it leads to a standing conflict of interest between them. There is fairly constant war between France and England in the French territories that the English control. They're always going back and forth across the border. And so now we come to the reign of John. John takes the throne in 1199 when Richard the Lionheart is killed in really a rather unimportant skirmish in the south of France in a territory that he controlled. You have John on the throne, and the King of France is immediately going to try to seize some land. But they come to an agreement. Okay? Everything is going to be fine. And then John gets married. And that screws everything up. It's one of the most disastrous marriages in English history. For a number of reasons, but one reason is because of who the bride is, and particularly because of where she comes from. This is Isabel of Angoulême. Angoulême is a small territory in southwestern France. The problem with Angoulême is that it adjoins the county of La Marche. And La Marche was ruled by a family that were constantly rebelling against King John. Now, John did not want the Count of La Marche to marry Isabel of Angoulême. They were engaged. So he wanted to block that marriage because he feared that if these 2 territories were united, then there would be this big indigestible block of rebel territory in the heart of his French dominions. So he doesn't want this marriage to go forward. So what is his solution? He marries the bride himself. He scoops in, takes the bride, marries her himself, and oh, by the way, they had been postponing this relationship, the Count of La Marche and Isabel, because the bride was 12 years old. But the king marries her anyway. Now, this might have been okay if the king had compensated the Count of La Marche for stealing his fiancée. But John was just the sort of guy not to do that. It would have been much better if he'd say, well, I'm sorry, I took your fiancée, but here is some extra land, here is a payment, it's all good. He didn't do that. He basically thumbed his nose at his own vassal, and that caused the Count of La Marche to appeal to the King of France. Because, of course, the King of France is the overlord of both the Count of La Marche and the King of England. So he appeals to the King of France, and the King of France has just been waiting for an opportunity to do something against King John. And here this is delivered to him on a silver platter. Because, of course, John has violated the rights of his vassal in taking the fiancée without compensation. And so the King of France confiscates the lands that the King of England owns in France. And then he actually makes good on the confiscation by force of arms. And he invades Normandy and he conquers it. Now, the King of England has lost all the land in France, or lots of it, okay? And particularly the land that people actually cared about, Normandy. And this is a complete disaster. Kings of France, or kings of any kingdom, are not supposed to lose land. If anything, you're supposed to increase it, not lose land. And now John is in a bind because he has to try to get the land back. He needs to pay for the reconquest. He can't pay for it because now all of a sudden he's not getting any revenue from that land anymore. So he has to tax England unmercifully in order to pay for the effort to get the land in France back. So he is now in a vicious circle because the more he taxes England, the more they hate him. Okay? But he has to get the land back or he will lose fame. 14, he basically makes one last effort to recover the land in France. He gathers together a coalition of continental allies, in particular his nephew, who is a German nobleman, in the northeast. And John is going to land in Poitou in the south on the coast, and then they're going to meet up, head towards Paris, and get the King of France sort of in a vice. But it doesn't work, okay, because John is bottled up on the coast. He can never meet his ally, so his ally has to go up against the King of France alone. And there is a battle between the King of France and this German ally, and the French win the battle. And the battle is called the Battle of Bouvines, and all commentators on Magna Carta will agree that there is pretty much a straight line from Bouvines to Runnymede, because the barons in England are basically waiting on the sidelines to see maybe they'll forgive him all the other stuff he's done. But if he's not, they're done with him. And this battle takes place in July of 1214. In the fall of 1214, the barons are already gathering together to talk about what to do about King John. And by the spring of that year, they are actively discussing some of the issues that end up in the draft of Magna Carta. So that's the foreign policy cause for Magna Carta, but there is also a character cause for Magna Carta, which is the fact that John was detested widely by his barons. He was regarded as untrustworthy, vicious, cruel. He was just the sort of person who you would have to extract promises from because he didn't keep his word. He was basically well known for that. He was somebody who acted arbitrarily. One of the things that he did to raise money for this continual effort to recover land in France was to fine people arbitrarily for offenses that sometimes were real and sometimes invented. He would lend money to people in unrealistic amounts and then have the debt hover over them. And so people were always scared of what John would do. He was very unpredictable and really just the best example, I think, of the kind of cruelty that John engaged in. He got into a dispute with one of his vassals named William de Brieuze, and he actually had the wife and son of this vassal. This was widely known. All the chroniclers of the time report it. It was widely known. So that was the kind of thing he did. And he also would go around to the castles of his barons and demand to sleep with their wives and daughters. This is the kind of man he was. So this is the kind of person who you would definitely want to promise on parchment that he was going to be a good boy.
Now, Bruce, you mentioned before, it's sort of anomalous that this became such an iconic document in the United States, and I guess part of it, maybe you can also talk about the reinterpretation by Edward Coke and the impact of the English Bill of Rights in this country then. But
sure, it's actually an interesting tale, and it's pretty straightforward. When at one point, strangely, I ended up teaching the American Revolution in graduate school at Yale. Ed Morgan was there, and they were desperate. The Americanists were all off doing work, so he said he'd take anyone who could stand and read, and I could do both. But I had to bone up on American history because it had been a few years. And what I realized in doing that was there was this interesting connection between Magna Carta through the Petition of Right to the Bill of Rights, to the colonial petitions, to the Constitution. And that's actually, I started my students that semester with Magna Carta. They were a little puzzled that that was their first reading. And the reason we see the link is textual. Each of those sources is citing the earlier source. But what happens to it in the 17th century is pretty remarkable. Which is exactly like the TV show, The Tudors. Oppressive, violent, driven by personal motive. And the Tudors were monarchs who believed in their own power. They thought that they were, in fact, quite the best thing around. And they weren't going to be troubled by the niceties of parliamentary precedents that had been built up over many decades. And they're powerful kings, so they did what they wanted. And Elizabeth is not that much different from her father, Henry. So England in the 1500s is a period where you have a lot of smoldering resentment amongst people or Catholics, but these folks, and they began to consider, what they could do. And a lot of them gathered in London. They were associated with the Society of Antiquaries. Sounds very tame, kind of a thing to go, a sleepy place to retire to after your active life. But it actually was a hotbed of revolutionary zeal. And the members there would read old documents. They would read old laws coming back from the Anglo-Saxon period and all the way on through Magna Carta and then laws that have been passed since to try and figure out what their strategy should be. One of them, Edward Coke, ends up as Chief Justice. And he rules in a number of cases in such a way in the 1606 to 1616, somewhere around that's when he serves, in such a way as to reinterpret Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a very narrow partisan document. The people who draw it up benefit from it. The same kind of argument was made about the American Constitution by Charles Beard many years ago. This is partly true and partly not. The barons were very interested in themselves, and so when they talked about people, they were really thinking of well-to-do people. They were thinking of free people, not the unfree. They were thinking of men, not women. That's kind of where they were. And Coke, in changed circumstances and a changed notion of what justice was, rethought it and said, we're going to extend this as a precedent to all men, to all people, not just to, in fact, this very narrow clique. And so in a number of rulings during that period, he did so. That led to, part of that was the Petition of Right, which followed, which was asking the king of the time to, in fact, honor a number of the basic items in Magna Carta that show up there. Those later get expanded on in 1688-89 during the Glorious Revolution to the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights. You can't quarter troops, due process rules. It's all kind of there, all of the legal principles burnt out. And that's what the Americans get, because that's when they're settling. That's when they're coming over and colonizing. They have libraries, they have books, they have Cook's commentaries, they read them, they apprentice at law in the same way that it's a similar kind of way that they do in England. And so they're keenly aware of that tradition. That is their heritage, and it's in their charters. And so, there's this, it's all one culture at that point. And Coke is huge for giving them a new way of thinking about Magna Carta.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Rob, why don't you talk a little about let's start with Magna Carta's influence on the colonial charters, because that's where it really started here. And go from there to the pre-revolutionary period, I guess. But
okay, so the language of the Magna Carta was reproduced in a number of the colonial charters. In at least one colony, the colonial governor reviewed legislation to make sure that it comported with Magna Carta. In the sort of the discourse, as far as we know of the time, people talked about claiming the same rights that Englishmen had. After the Revolution, they wouldn't speak in those terms, but before the Revolution, they did. So all of that was happening before we had the series of documents that we talk about as our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, and including the Bill of Rights portion. So in the Declaration of Independence, I mean, there's an obvious similarity because they're listing a series, or they're creating a series of complaints about the king, and in this case, justifying why they're separating from the king. So the war is just starting. In the Declaration of Independence, there are some statements that refer to not only the Magna Carta, but the lineage of the Magna Carta. For example, when it says that the king has created a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, the writers are talking about how the principle of the authority being subject to law was not being followed. And of course, our Constitution didn't mean a specific document. It meant all of the principles and customs that English law followed. So that's the Declaration of Independence. In the Constitution itself, there are several references that also connect to the Magna Carta. The first one is in Article 1, listing out the powers of the national legislature, where it says that the privilege of habeas corpus will not be suspended except by Congress and except in very limited circumstances. I should explain just really briefly that habeas corpus is a form of pleading in which you request to be brought before a court so that you can show that you're unjustly confined by the state. So that's why a lot of people talk about habeas corpus as sort of the most basic right as against the government, because it allows you, no matter what the circumstances of your confinement, to come in and say this fact of confinement is unlawful and I must be released. So you go back to Article 39 that Judge Lamberth mentioned earlier that says that no one will be taken or no one land. And so the law of the land meant that if the confinement was unjust, then you ought to be able to appeal it. You ought to be able to seek relief from it. And this was true whether you were simply captured by the government, whether you had been tried and convicted and had exhausted all of your appeals so that appeals were no longer possible, whether you were captured and not charged with anything. And I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but that's the situation of the Guantanamo detainees today. And when we talk about the legacy of the Magna Carta in our time, I'll say more about that. But so habeas corpus is a form of pleading, and it is the procedure that allows many state detainees to go free, both in England in earlier times and right through to today. So in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, there is this provision that states the importance of habeas corpus, which connects to Magna Carta, as I've said, and says that it can't be suspended except in very limited circumstances. Then there are the provisions granting a speedy trial, trial by jury, and due process. All of those are reproduced in the Bill of Rights part of the Constitution. So there are two due process clauses in the U.S. Constitution, both the 5th and the 14th Amendment. So the 5th was adopted as part of the original Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. Both refer to due process, and again, we'll say more about this later, but due process is another way of saying law of the land. Incidentally, if you want to talk about how the Magna Carta continues to influence law today, and I literally mean today, Julie told me earlier that the Supreme Court ruled this morning on a case called Kerry v. Dinn, and that they cite the Magna Carta for this very principle, that due process means law of the land. So the due process clause has a direct textual connection to the Magna Carta. And then, of course, there's the right to jury trial, because Article 39 and 40 say that you can't be imprisoned or punished except by lawful judgment of your peers or by law of the land. and that to no one will be delay or deny justice. So each of these refers to trial by jury, respectively, and the right to a speedy trial as well. So these are provisions in the Bill of Rights. So you see that in the Constitution itself, we've enacted language that operationalizes these guarantees that are set forth in the Magna Carta, and they become directly part of our law. And of course, since we do have a written constitution, unlike Britain, right, so lawyers will cite to these provisions and even use these rights as a source of an action many times in court.
And Bruce, I take it that a number of state constitutions enacted at that time did the same, relied on language from the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights.
It's certainly in a lot of the colonial statutes and charters. It's in a lot of the charters, and is something that through the 1600s is well known to all throughout the colonies, Georgia all the way up to New Hampshire. So this is something that is initially than what someone in England might have felt. But it's the increasing alienation of the colonies that gives it more freight, because they start going back to these because those are the things that are challenged by the English monarchs. And they say, well, hold on, what is our charter? And it starts to actually take on a new life for them.
Good. You also, Bruce, were talking about the myth of the Magna Carta. Let's talk a little more about what the myth is.
Well, a couple things to say here. One, myth is not a bad word, right? Myth is, I was reading the op-eds today, partly out of vanity. I got to do an op-ed for the first time. No one asks medievalists to do op-eds. So this is it. This was it, I was seeing there's a lot of very similar kinds of things, but people were talking about the myth, and I don't think I used myth, and as if it were a bad thing, that I'm going to expose this document as something like a fairy tale. Well, myth actually isn't that. It's a powerful story in some way. It's something that maybe takes on power outside of its mere words. You could say the Bible has mythic qualities to it. This is fine. So when I use myth, I'm meaning it in that sense. I think we tend to, as Americans, miss some things about Magna Carta that are kind of, they're in the footnotes, so to speak. But they're the kind of interesting things that I think make it come to life. And these, instead of demythologizing it, I think you just keep these things in mind and say, well, this is a human product. Human society is complex, and what it produces is a reflection of that. Well, Magna Carta is a statement of principles, about due process. Robert was talking about due process, the key one, chapter 39. But it also includes several chapters. A chapter is just, might be 20 words that describe something, that draw their text from a early 12th century forgery by Geoffrey of Monmouth, which is about the kings of Britain and Arthur. And this is what people are reading, and they're reading it in Latin, they're reading it in translation. It's available in French at the time, and somehow words make it into the final document. So that's kind of interesting. And then the second is that a number of the key principles about the king being just are first found not in the various drafts and documents of the barons. We can actually track their process of writing Magna Carta. It's really fantastic. You can't do that with many documents. But the earliest document where we see that stuff taking form is something called the Laws of the English, the Leges Anglorum. It is a forgery. It claims to be the laws of Eber the Confessor, which it is not. And someone has put in Arthur, who is a great legislator and conqueror, has put in all these maxims about how kings ought to be just and ought to rule by right, and a king who does not rule by right is no king at all, and so on. But it's a forgery that they're including it into. I don't know if they know it isn't a law code per se. So that's kind of interesting. The most radical parts of the Magna Carta get cut out. So we get the stuff that, through the tests of time, which means politics, the things that survive through politics, like due process and jury trial, we get those now. But at the time, Magna Carta had a clause for enforcement that was quite revolutionary. The barons would form a council, and when the king misbehaved, they would basically appoint a posse to go after him and rustle his cattle, Or that's the process called distraint. We're going to take a lot of your property until you behave, John. And so and John agrees to that. Now that gets starts, but I mean, that's a remarkable thing. I mean, it's pretty remarkable what survives, but that's even more remarkable. And then the last thing I alluded to earlier, we tend to think, because we're a very text-oriented constitutional culture, as Robert has mentioned, the British don't have a constitution, and it works out okay over there. They've done all right over the centuries. But we think it's very important to have everything in writing. And so we think of writing as here are the words. Here is what the king and the barons agreed. These are what was said. Well, if you look at what happened to Magna Carta after it was issued, so 1215, they agree to it, gets sealed. Copies are ordered to be sent out. Then they're immediately annulled by the Pope, who basically considers John a vassal. 1216, it gets reissued as a way to end the Civil War. 1217, and then 1225 is the big one, and then there's the one in the 30s, and there's one in the 50s maybe. It gets reissued a bunch of times with different chapters. And that's confusing enough, because there is no point where someone says, well, hold on, that's the old edition. You can't cite that in court. Creative scribes began to combine them, taking the parts they liked and dumping the parts they didn't. So anyone walking into a library and say 1230 and saying, well, I've heard about Magna Carta in Rome. I came all the way to see what a fantastic, well, they say which version? We have like 30 or 40 different versions of it. And they didn't sort out which king had signed it for 500 years. They thought it was Henry III, not John. And so again, it's in Cook's day, or actually after Cook. It's in the 1700s that they sort that out. So it's a document, but not kind of like our Constitution in that sense.
You had some skepticism, Jenny, about whether it's worked better in England or here.
Oh, I don't know if this is the occasion for that when we're all talking about Anglo-American friendship today. So,
Rob, you want to talk about the myth?
Sure. I mean, as Bruce was saying, there are a lot of different dimensions to myth and a lot of different ways of understanding what a myth is. But in one specific sense, people have written. Edward Jenks in 1904 wrote an article basically saying that this was not a document that spoke for the common people. This was not an origin of cherished rights. It was simply an agreement between one wealthy person and a group of other wealthy people. And I mean, it's pretty clear that you can't disagree with that on those specific terms. But like the U.S. Constitution, we have a constitutional culture that incorporates a number of myths, including the myth that we were born a free nation, right? There were some people who were very much unfree when the nation was born. So I guess my take on the question of the myth is that it's undoubtedly correct to say that there are a number of mythic
that all men are created equal.
Right.
Did not include
exactly right, Judge Lambert. So yeah, but at the same time, we can utilize that myth, and it can still shape our law, and we can move toward a position in law that's actually closer to what the myth was stating.
I had another question I wanted to ask all the panelists, and that is, what do you think is the continuing influence of Magna Carta today? And we'll talk about some specific things, for example, executive action. Rob, you want to talk about that one first?
Yes. So first of all, I mean, there are some real concrete, specific questions today about executive action that force us to ask really what is the executive subject to law, which is the basic thrust of Article 39, right, that the authority is subject to law. You can take the example of drone strikes, for example. This is a due process question in the sense that something's being taken away from people, namely their lives, without a hearing, without any kind of judicial ruling, but simply as a result of internal deliberations with has explained that to them, due process doesn't always mean judicial process. In other words, due process is a flexible concept. Any lawyer will tell you that, but that in fact it's so flexible that it can be stretched to say that you can deprive someone of their life without going to a court. The deliberations that suffice to be due process can take place completely outside of a court and without any judicial official being involved. And this is something I think we need to talk very seriously about, because what does due process mean if the executive can take life without a trial? I mean, that sort of directly contradicts what Article 39 says.
The barons certainly didn't think that's what they were doing with King John, did they?
I think they would have had a problem with that, yes. And then there's something that some legal theorists talk about, which is a state of emergency or state of exception. So back in the earlier 20th century, Carl Schmitt came up with this theory of the state of exception and basically said that there was always a space beyond law in which the executive had to operate at certain times. And so the executive was normally bound by the restrictions of the Constitution in a constitutional republic, but that sometimes that state of things had to be suspended, and we moved into this other space beyond rules, beyond constraint for the executive. Obviously, this is a fundamental problem of legal theory, because once you say the executive is not bound by law, not only are you going against this core principle of the Magna Carta, but you're also in a sort of, there are no limits, essentially. Some legal scholars have struggled with this idea, trying to come up with a model of what would an emergency constitution look like. Bruce Ackerman has said that we could have an emergency constitution that kicks in at a certain point, and then it would suspend certain kinds of limits on executive power, and then for it to continue, it would have this is quite a mouthful, but a supermajoritarian escalator, which is classic academic jargon, but it's not a thing in a shopping mall. It's actually a principle that says the longer the state of exception goes on, the larger the supermajority that has to approve it. So scholars have grappled with this idea, and particularly after September 11th, if there's going to be a state of exception, an emergency constitution, what triggers it, how long does it last, what rules apply? And it's one of these tantalizing problems, because once you admit that there are no limits, how do you put limits back in? So that's the sort of one of the conundra of executive authority in our time, looking back to this basic principle of authority is subject to law.
That's an excellent answer. I appreciate that. Jenny, talk about jury trial and how Magna Carta is obviously, from my opening comments,
well,
I think it's had a great influence in this country.
It actually belongs sort of in the category of the myths of Magna Carta, because the word jury does not appear anywhere in Magna Carta. So the idea that Clause 39 of Magna Carta guarantees the right to a trial by jury is actually a much later interpretation of Magna Carta. That's not what anybody thought in 1215. It's a really interesting example of how two phenomena can coincide in time and then over a period of time actually coalesce. So what you have is Magna Carta being agreed to in 1215, and that very year you have a huge event in the Catholic Church called the Fourth Lateran Council, where Pope Innocent III, who annulled Magna Carta, gathered together a huge assembly of bishops and other church leaders and hashed out a number of very important issues before the church at the time. And one of the things that they did was to ban clerical participation in the judicial ordeal. Now, probably a lot of you have heard of the ordeal. This is where people are forced to walk across hot coals or hold hot irons or be thrown in the water, and if the water accepts them, if they sink, then they're innocent. If the water rejects them and they float, then they're guilty. Now, of course, you have to fish them out in time. They drown. This is something that people make fun of now. I mean, there's a wonderful scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail about the judicial ordeal. But this was very serious business in 1215. A lot of decisions about guilt or innocence across Europe were made on this basis. And the church had grown uncomfortable with it and withdrew its approval. And this almost immediately caused the ordeal to wither on the vine. And they needed something else to put in place in order to decide guilt or innocence in criminal cases. Now, interestingly, on the continent, what they came up with was the inquisitorial process. Okay. In England, they went in a different direction. And by the way, that involves torture. Right? In England, they never embraced torture. Instead, what they came up with as a fix was the jury trial. So juries had been around for other purposes for many years. They were fact-finding bodies. They had been used by William the Conqueror, for example, after the conquest, to try to figure out what did he have in the Doomsday Inquest, where he went around and found out what all the land was and how much it was worth. That was run on the system of local juries. So juries get co-opted to take the place of the judicial ordeal. And over time, people start to assume that the clause about judgment by your peers refers to trial by jury. Okay. But that's not, in fact, how it was interpreted in 1215, because there was no right to a jury trial. There were no jury trials in 1215. So that's one of the signal myths of Magna Carta. By the 14th century, people are making that connection, and by the 17th century, with Cook and other commentators, people are flat out saying that Magna Carta guarantees the right to a trial by jury.
And from the beginning of our country, then, we really did believe in trial by jury.
Absolutely believed that that was a guaranteed right as of Magna Carta. It's not in there.
And what about speedy trial?
Well, Clause 40 of Magna Carta says that to no one will we deny or delay justice. So this is the idea that you have to get your judgment in a reasonably speedy fashion. And it is an outgrowth of the sort of things that John would do, which is to imprison people sometimes for years without judgment. And he would do this basically to extort more and more money out of the person concerned and out of their family. So one of the really interesting things that you can do in reading Magna Carta is to see what King John was actually doing by what he was being told not to do. Okay? And the speedy trial is definitely
that was certainly one
of those.
Right. Rob, talk a little more about habeas corpus, because that's really, in this country, it's turned out to be extremely in this country. Habeas is the key to the judiciary deciding a lot of things in this country.
Yes, we can go through U.S. history and find conflicts where habeas corpus figured very prominently. During the years preceding the Civil War, habeas corpus was used both to return slaves to their captors and sometimes for slaves to be freed and sometimes for slave catchers to be freed. In Prigg, Pennsylvania, actually the slave catcher was prosecuted under a law prohibiting kidnapping, and then he sought relief through habeas corpus, saying my prosecution, my confinement are fundamentally unjust because Pennsylvania did not have the authority to pass this law. It interferes with fugitive slave enforcement in the Constitution. So habeas corpus is this very powerful tool, but like any other tool, it can be used for different ends. And then when we jump ahead to the Warren Court in the 1950s, the Warren Court broadens access to habeas corpus as part of a more general project of increasing access to the judicial system, political process, striking down, as everyone knows, state-enforced racial segregation. In one particular case, Justice Brennan refers directly to the Magna